Our final speaker in this session is Keith DeLacy, and he's going to talk about scale, integration and energy, one path to the future. Keith.
Thanks, Kerry. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Harding and Bob Manning, our host. I'd also like to recognise Mayor Will Atwood from the Etheridge Shire, because that's a very important shire in the presentation that I'm going to make to you today. And to my fellow speakers, may I compliment them on their sartorial elegance. I feel a little underdone, but in defence, I've got to say we are in the tropics. And I was telling someone before, I went to a AICD, a company directors event in Mackay once, and we had on the invitation tropical formal was the dress. And somebody got up and asked me, they said, "What do you mean by tropical formal? What is that?" I said, "Don't wear thongs." Just one comment about, Hugh, your paper, when you talk about the coming dominance of China and India. That's really just a resumption of the status quo. That's what it was 2,000 years ago. So we're back to where we started. Let's see what I can do here. In developed economies, we've got almost a cultural and political attachment to the family farm. It's almost a romantic notion, and in developing countries, also to smallholders. But the fact of life is that scale brings capital, innovation, market power, economies, management expertise, local processing, and so much more. That's where we can get real economic development, yet we seem to be fixated on small is beautiful. I've got a view that governments around the world have kept farmers poor, by supporting them too much. If you give them too much support, you don't get those structural adjustments that are necessary to cope with changing technology and what have you. And you'll very often too, if you get too much support, you'll get overproduction in regional sort of markets. You would think in Northern Australia, tropical Australia, that we've got absolutely everything to be a great agricultural producer. We've got water like you wouldn't believe. There is 3 times as much water flows into the Gulf of Carpentaria as is the whole of the Murray-Darling system. 90 million megalitres flows into the Gulf of Carpentaria. Just over 30 million is the Murray-Darling system, and that drains most of Victoria, New South Wales and a lot of Queensland. We've got soil, enormous amount. You fly over Northern Australia and you'll see how much country there is, and there's a recent CSIRO report which says in the Gilbert River system itself, catchment area, there's 2 million hectares of land which is suitable in part to agriculture. Sometimes we lose sight of the importance of sunshine in agricultural production, but it's absolutely fundamental. And in the Northern Australia, and particularly when you get away from the coastal regions, the amount of solar radiation is quite extraordinary, and we've got figures that can back that up. I love this slide. Talk about markets, but see that little circle above Australia there? There are more people live inside that circle than live outside that circle. And that's more than 70% of the increase in agricultural consumption will occur in that circle over the next 50 years. And you can see the proximity that has to Northern Australia. So we've got absolutely everything. The north, the tropics, we've got everything. Yet we've failed abysmally to deliver on our potential. If we look at the agricultural production and sugar and beef cattle in Northern Australia, that haven't changed that much over the last 100 years in terms of growth and so forth. Tropical Australia remains underpopulated and economically underperforming. Now, I'm not talking about the coastal region, which is dominated, Alex, by tourism generally and lifestyle kinds of things. Most towns, again, apart from that coastal ribbon, but most towns in tropical Australia are actually losing population and losing services. So we just haven't found a way to realise our potential, even though we can have we've had so many white papers and so many green papers, and we just haven't done it. There's got to be a way forward. So I'm talking sort of globally. The message is global, but I've obviously got to talk locally to give you an example. So I'm going to talk about the Etheridge Integrated Agricultural Project. If you see EIAP, that's what I'm talking about. I'll just explain the fundamentals behind that, explain why it'll work, and other things haven't worked over the years. I'm not sure whether this shows. Well, I'm talking about this area. It's in the central southern peninsula of North Queensland. Here's Cairns here, and here's the lower Gulf of Carpentaria, Corumba over there. So it's halfway between Cairns and the Gulf, if you like. And the river systems, they call that, this is the Gilbert River. The Gilbert River is the most southern one. There's two others that run into it, the Etheridge there and the Ainslie. We actually take our water off the Ainslie, but it eventually joins. Now, the Gilbert River system is 1.5 times as big in terms of outflow as the Ord, 5.5 million litres on average outflow each year. So it's a pretty big system in that. But all monsoonal, the flows are during the summer or the monsoon season, and most of the year, of course, those rivers don't run at all. Got to go forward. That's just another look at it. This is the Ainslie River. All these rivers rise behind the wet tropics, and that's why they get such a big flow in the wet season. We propose to have an off-river water storage. We're calling it Dagworth Lake, but we will harvest water from the Ainslie River during the big flood events. These are the foothills, just God-given water storage, topography for water storage in that part of the world. Gravity feed down to a smaller, that's 1.6 million megalitres, incidentally, about the size of Wivenhoe. It'd be in the top 10 dams in Australia. Dare I say, twice as deep as on average as most other dams, and that, of course, halves the evaporation. And down to a smaller storage of 400,000 megalitres. This is all of the production area, and this is in the sort of alluvial floodplain kind of area, so it's good it's sufficiently good for agriculture. So that's all of our production. You mightn't believe it, but there's 1,250 40-hectare blocks there. So that fundamentally explains where we are and what we're doing. This is a very, very busy chart, I appreciate, but as the point I will be making is that it's both scale and integration that underlines the economics. We've got our own water storage. This is all of the farming. It's the fundamental part of it all. 40,000 hectares of irrigated sugarcane and 25,000 hectares of guar. You may say, what is guar? It's a legume. It's been around for a long time as a food thickener, but it's got a special application these days in the fracking, coal seam or shale fracking process, and that sort of underwrites its demand going forward. In terms of production, you can see we've got half a dozen processing plants. The main one is the sugar mill. The sugar mill will produce almost 600,000 tonnes of sugar and 100 megalitres of ethanol. We've got a cogen plant. At this stage, we're proposing 90 megawatts of electricity, about half of which we can sell into the grid. It's a pretty immature grid up in that part of the world. We could make a lot more electricity from our biomass, from the sugar, but that's so far is all we need for ourselves and all we can sell. So we sell about half of it, and the rest of it we consume ourselves in all of our processing plants and farming and what have you. We've got a guar gum plant, and that's central to it all. But because I talk about integration. I'll talk about this a bit more later. But if we use the hull and germ from this legume, of course, the guar, if we use the cane tops, if we use the bagasse and so forth, we can make 400,000 tonnes of stock feed. Now, there's a lot of cattle up in that part of the world. They're all cattle properties. We've got options on 5 cattle properties. But they lose live weight during the dry season. And to a large extent, that's why abattoirs are very difficult to work in Northern Australia, because you can only get a supply of cattle for half the year, effectively. People don't send their cattle into market after they start losing weight during the dry season. Why would you send them in today when they were 20 kilograms heavier a month ago? However, we've got 400,000 tonnes of stock feed, so we can process, by working with the local farmers, we can ensure that the stock don't lose weight during the year, which means we can have 12 months supply into a basic abattoir. It's only a basic one into quarters, it doesn't do all the boning out. So we're talking about processing 200,000 cattle a year, 53,000 tonnes of beef. But again, just making that point about integration, the reason our abattoir works is because we've got 12 months supply and we've got our own electricity, and that electricity is effectively free because we justify the capital spend on the cogeneration plant by what we can sell into the grid, which means everything else we've got there is powered by our own free renewable electricity. We could talk about that particular slide all day. You'll note at the top it's got a red claw pond. Somebody said, why don't you do aquaculture up there? And somebody did an exercise for us, quite extraordinary, that when we treat our wastewater from the sugar mill and from the meat processing and what have you, it produces methane, which of course we can generate electricity from methane. But it leaves in the water I don't understand all this properly, but a carbohydrate bacteria, which it seems is an ideal feed for red claw. Red claw can grow on that, so we just use the water one more time. When the red claw are finished with the water, it becomes irrigation, and they leave nutrient in that water, which is very valuable as a nutrient for sugarcane. So that's the way in which everything works together. Mostly we don't put the red claw there because we don't want to look like the dog chasing every ute that goes down the street. But I think some of these add-ons can be very, very beneficial, and just another use of the existing water that we have. Just very quickly, the capital expenditure is $2 billion. I won't go through the detail of that. On our numbers so far, we've got, leaving out the red claw and some of those other add-ons, is about $900 million of total revenue and 350 in round terms of EBITDA. I think the important message to take out of that, there's $550 million worth of expenditure. That all goes into labour, to consumables, to services and what have you, all into the far north, and much of it into that particular shire. So you can see the economic benefit that will remain. I won't go through all of these, except I think I really should make these first two. Carbon sustainability, if you believe the story of the day about global warming and carbon dioxide emissions and so forth. But this would be a zero carbon project. We produce renewable all of the electricity we consume is renewable, produced ourselves. We sell renewable electricity into the grid. We can produce, because we can't use all of the dry matter that we have, we're going to produce 400,000 tonnes of bio pellets, dry pellets, which are effectively just stored energy. If we proceed with the ethanol, 100 megalitres of ethanol is 9 times the liquid fuels that we consume in our production. So whichever way you want to measure this, it's very attractive from a carbon point of view. And ecological sustainability, we believe in off-river storages because they're much more ecologically sustainable, much more efficient. CSIRO recently did a report, the report I referred to about the soil, and they proposed in-river storages, the way in which we've done it for the last 100 years, 1,000 years, or whatever it is. But we can store 3 times as much water as what they proposed for half the cost of what they proposed with our off-river storage. But it's much more sustainable in the sense that we only harvest from the big flows, from the big floods, not from the small floods, which an in-river storage does. It doesn't impede the migration of fish during the floods and during the wet season up the river. The water that that goes back into the river isn't that cold water that does damage as well. So off-river storage has got to be the way of the future. Maybe CSIRO will wake up to that one day. Many of these others, you can take them away if you want a copy of this and study them in the tranquility of your boudoir or wherever. We've just very quickly reached negotiated agreements with five properties. We pay them options on their properties, 326,000 hectares. We've done an enormous amount of work proving it up. We've signed a development protocol with the Queensland Government, which means so long as we tick the boxes as we go through, we'll have the water allocation at the end of it. The state government has declared it a coordinated project under the province, if you like, of the Coordinator General, and we're well progressed with pre-construction phase capital raise. We've got to raise $15 million to take it right through approval to bankable feasibility. All right. After all the failures in Northern Australia, and what I referred to as a pretty abysmal performance in terms of the growth of agriculture and meeting all of these grand schemes of the Food Bowl for Asia or Australia in the Asian century and what have you, what is different? Why is what we're doing different? I'll just go through those, so I won't leave them up there. But the first thing is scale. Scale is absolutely fundamental. When we first put this to the Queensland Government, they said, Jesus, it's big, it might be a bit tough, could you do it half the size? No, it doesn't work. Because you've got to be big enough to justify all of the local processing on site. And if you're too small, you cannot do that. Smallholders cannot do that. You've got to be sufficient size. I think I said there's about 7 different processing plants there. There's a sugar mill, there's a cogen plant, there's an ethanol, there's a guar plant, there's a beef processing, there's a cattle feed processing. There's half a dozen, 6 or 7 different processing plants, about $750 million worth. Well, you can't do that if you're just running a family farm. But there are other advantages in size. I mean, you'll have all the efficiencies of innovation. We would have, because we're large enough, we would have our own agronomist, our own pest and disease expert and so forth. And all of the innovation that comes from having that capital base of being large enough. Market power, of course, one of the problems. You look at the dairy farmers and how they're always in trouble with Coles and Woolworths and so forth. If you've got no market power, it's all unequal and you don't have that kind of strength. Market power is also important when you're buying things, I might say. If you're going to buy 100 tractors, you'll get a lot better deal than if you're buying 1 tractor. And we will have more than 100 tractors. And ultimately, it is more efficient and therefore it is more environmentally sustainable. If you get more product per unit of water or per area of land, then obviously that's a better environmental outcome. So scale is everything. I know we always say small is beautiful, big is bad and what have you, but if you're really serious about developing in tropical areas, I think this is the way you've got to go. Just a couple of comments I just made, but and the allocation of water, it becomes very political, but should water be allocated on the amount of benefit you can get per megalitre, amount of economic benefit, the number of jobs you create per unit, or should it be allocated on the basis of political expediency, the feel-good kind of one? That's the question. These are some of the things you've got to face up to if you're really serious about getting development in these isolated regions of the north. Energy, something we've never woken up to or never quite understood, the light bulb moment. But the capacity to produce biomass in the tropics is extraordinary, and biomass is just stored energy. So if you do it right, you can produce all of your own electricity, all of your own energy, and gee, that makes a massive difference to the economies of what you're trying to do. And as I said, we've effectively, all of our processing plants, the economies of those are underwritten by free, renewable electricity. The other thing, and this is where the ord went wrong, you know, everybody, you had somebody owned the water, the government, a private person owned the mill, you had all different farmers, family farms, the price of sugar went down, the farmers decided they'd grow soybean instead of sugar, so the mill goes broke. We've just got a single entity, a single farmer, we own the water, we do the farming, and we do all the processing. Everything perfectly aligned for the same outcome. The other part of the integration, I'm just flashing that one there again, but the waste from one process becomes the feedstock for another process. So we've got $1 billion worth of revenue there, but there won't be a kilogram worth of waste. Everything will be used and reused. Climate, you know, I've been in agriculture now more than 70 years. I was born on a farm up in this part of the world, would you believe, in Reebert-Imbula, and started life as a tobacco farmer. But I'm not suggesting we should be growing tobacco, incidentally. But, you know, if you're on a farm, it's always that old story of the commodity price cycle and the weather cycle. And can you ever beat them? We reckon we have. I often tell a story about the old two farmers talking. You know, what would you do, Jack, if you won the gold lotto? He said, oh, I don't know, Fred. He said, I guess I'd just keep farming until it was all gone. And that's because you're dealing with those cycles. But we've actually taken the weather out of the equation. On our storage and consumption metrics, we had an independent hydrologist look at it and the river flow for the last 120 years since we've had records, and we would have had, over the last 120 years, 120 full crops. So it's 100% reliable. And one of the problems with sugar along the coast, of course, is the cyclones and those sorts of weather events. This is 330 kilometres inland, so by the time a cyclone crosses the coast, by the time it gets in there, it's just a rain depression and so forth. So we've effectively taken weather. I can't say we've taken the commodity price cycle out of it, but with our size and ability to forward sell and so forth, to a certain extent we can. I mentioned the water storage, and I probably have discussed that, but we believe that the water storage, off-river water storage is the way to go, and particularly in those foothill kind of areas where the topography is just perfect for storing water. I just say this, but sugar, we know how to grow sugarcane in Queensland and the whole world, so when we go out to the markets, at least they will understand that. It's the same latitude as here, or the same as Mareeba, if you like, which is a lot drier than Cairns, where they've got very good irrigated sugarcane, so they know that we can do it. All of the processing has all been done before, so it's sort of off the shelf. Mind you, you know, with all of we've learnt over the years, we'd have state-of-the-art. So we would hope that we'd have state-of-the-art processing, but off the shelf to a certain extent, because it's all been done before. Okay, so I'm back. This is a summary. Why is this one going to work? What do we do to get real agricultural development in the tropics or in the north? We've got to change our mindset. And that mindset is about scale. I know I keep talking like the glower in the pet shop, but scale is absolutely fundamental to it all. And water allocations, I made reference to that. You've got to be prepared and bold enough to allocate enough water. Now, I quickly make the point that all we're proposing is to consume 10%, just under 10% of the flow from the Gilbert River system. That's highly sustainable. There's a rule of thumb around Australia that 2/3 goes to the environment, 1/3 you can harvest. That's what they want to get the Murray-Darling back to. So all we're proposing is less than 10% of the flow, of the average annual flow of the Gilbert River system, so there's plenty of water there for other people as well. But we need to change that mindset. Policy, a few years ago, dare I say, I don't think we could have proceeded with this, but there are such things as tenure and land clearing and water allocations and what have you. The Queensland Government has been very supportive, so we're finding our way through all of those difficult policy setting areas. Do anything in Australia. Dare I say, the regulations is a nightmare. That's both federal government responsible regulations and state governments as well. Every government in the world has got a red tape committee. They're going to do away with red tape, but I have never yet seen the red tape go away. It grows quicker than you get rid of it. Federal government more than state government, but we need to have a look at the tax incentives. We are having difficulty, I don't hide from that, of raising our $15 million because that money has got to go in today. It's a high risk, obviously the first part of it, till it's all proven up. It's pretty high risk. You don't get a return for 7 years. And people would have that money out all of that period of time. There has got to be incentive, and I think it's got to be circumscribed. You don't just throw money at anybody or give it incentives, but if you're producing a lot of infrastructure, which we're proposing, a lot of economic development, a lot of jobs, 1,200 permanent jobs there would be up and there with our project. They've got to look at a way, maybe tax deduction on the way in, and high net worths can put it in. It won't really help us because we'll be too far down the track, but that's what the federal government has really got to look at. I've made a number of other presentations, but it's fundamental that if we do what we always did, we'll get what we always got. We've got to look at doing them a different way, a way that works. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Got a few questions there. You couldn't help but be impressed by Keith's presentation. If there are no ifs and buts, Keith, what you're saying is, yeah, there were risks, but we've basically answered all. Are you saying this is risk-free now?
I've been around too long to say something's risk-free, but I've got to say with this project, once we got those fundamental concepts in place, there's another half a dozen of these in North Queensland. If we can, set out the pathway. And the longer I stick with this and the more we work with it, the more robust it becomes, both in a technical sense and in a financial sense. So I'm not saying there's no risk, but I can understand people being a bit sceptical. This is very large. I bring my resources hat to this a little bit too. If you are going to develop a coal mine, a $2 billion coal mine, well, so what? There's a million of those out there. But a $2 billion agricultural project, people's eyes start to spin. There's no doubt this is the biggest agricultural biggest agricultural project in Australia, probably in the world. So there's a bit of cynicism, and people to put that early money in is not easy. But no, I think it's. I put a lot of my own money in, and I'm comfortable with that. My wife's not quite so comfortable with it, but.
But when you talk about lessons learned, what have you learnt them from? I've got this vague memory of a project called Lakeland Downs going back to the 70s and 80s that promised the world. It was going to do huge things. What happened to Lakeland Downs? And
of course, some of those did have scale, but they weren't always tropical crops in tropical areas. What I went through there was, it works. Scale, number 1, 2 and 3. Integration, those things never involved integration. And owning all parts of it, but also the energy. We've only just woken up that we can produce our own energy, and gee, if you've got free electricity, doesn't that change the economics of virtually anything at all? So no, that's the deal. We've looked at that. We looked at the Ord like you wouldn't believe, but we looked at Lakeland Downs. We looked at Tipperary Station, and sort of went through it. And yeah, I reckon we.
And what were the lessons of Cubby, of which you would share?
Cubby, we learned a lot, but Cubby is Cubby is not quite as reliable. It's only about 75% as reliable, and it got into trouble in the so-called Millennium Drought, when when the drought went on for 2 years longer than any other drought for 100 years. Everybody in New South Wales said we were taking all their water. What they forgot is we had no water either. But nevertheless, Cubby is a very successful venture. It is still now, even though ownership has changed, it's producing $150 million worth of product every year. And it's an enormous benefit to that Dirranbandi, St George area of Queensland. So we learned a lot from it, I kid you not. And John Grabby, who was with Cubby, is the person, in my view, the most creative hydrology, water storage, irrigation sort of person in Australia. He's part of our team.
And when you said there's half a dozen others like this that could be developed in the north, where would they be getting their water?
The Mitchell River, this river, the Gilbert River has got 5.5 million megalitres outflow. The Mitchell River's 12 million. In fact, outside of the Murray-Darling, it's the biggest river in Australia in terms of outflow. And millions of hectares of land. But you've got to be large enough because there's no infrastructure, and you've got to be creative about the products you're going to do. And we've had a look at some of these, and it just makes your head spin. They are there. If we can establish the pathway, there are more of these.
And what about getting to market?
Market?
Well, that's the bit at the end that gives you the money.
Yeah, well, that's important, yeah. Well, it's got to be processed. It's processed as much as you can because that's cheaper transport. And you've certainly got to look at a product where the demand, the so-called middle-class products is where the future is. You know, as the increasing in the middle class in Asia, they are consuming things that they didn't used to consume before. Sugar is one of those, but all of the meat, protein kind of products are absolutely vital, and we can grow those in a big way like this up there as well.
So... just make it brief, though.
Richard Faulkner. I'm an irrigation engineer, 40 years experience all over the world in all the tropics. And I was just saying that one of the problems with the Ord was that, as an example, a small example, that the differences in the situation there compared to the south weren't properly or scientifically considered. So that pests, as an example, the pests were a big problem in that particular instance, which can now be addressed. And I was saying that the scheme that we've just heard about is a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate that these very large schemes can really work and really reproduce, particularly in a country like Australia.
So you're convinced?
I'm convinced as far as Australia is concerned, Kerry, yes, but I would also like to say that I've spent a lot of time working in tropical Africa, and the situation there is simply different from a managerial, a labour point of view. I mean, many of my early years as an engineer was spent working on schemes in Kaino, Sokoto, places in Nigeria and Kenya, and unfortunately, because of the lack of consideration of who would actually operate them and whether the local farmers could learn to use the systems that were designed for them. They weren't involved in the design of the systems. They were monumental failures, unfortunately, quite a few of them. And that's when this Schumacher came out with this idea of small is beautiful. But I think, as Keith has said, what we need is horses for courses. I think in some places small is appropriate, and certainly as far as producing the sort of outcome that Keith's been talking about, then large scale is obviously appropriate.
Well, I'm not sure that I get a response from you there, because he's actually endorsing you. But
we're very conscious of taking a new crop into an area and planting it there because, yes, so often pests and diseases, you know, there are many things. But that's why we focused on sugarcane, why we made it. We had a lot of selections because we do grow sugarcane in North Queensland. We've been through these issues. It doesn't mean to say we won't get pests and diseases, but we believe we'd have the capital base and the technology there whenever those come that we'd be on top of them quickly. But that is a big issue. A new crop in a new area, you can get diseases like you wouldn't believe.
Hugh, with your outline, and I've been to other conferences where Indonesia, in the long run, is promoted to as high as fourth biggest economy in the world in the future, at some point in the future. Do you feel Australia fully understands, fully comprehends commercially, forget politics, but commercially, in terms of opportunity, do you think Australia fully comprehends the potential that Indonesia offers?
No, Australia clearly doesn't fully comprehend, and it's really a function of the fact that China and India are so immense that a $250 million population economy can actually be relegated to the shadows. But I was having a conversation with Graham Hugo about this yesterday, the demographer, for those who weren't here on the first day, and he was actually, he cut his teeth studying Indonesia back in the 70s, and that was what Australian economists who wanted to take an international bent to their work did in the 70s. They studied Indonesia. There was a time, I think, when it was up in neon lights. But there's a generation that's Graham's age or Howell Hill's age at the ANU who understand Indonesia inside out. The issue is that there isn't a generation of students which have come through and have taken that on board. So I don't think we actually have a generation coming up which really comprehends the Indonesian story.
Which could come at great cost to us. because with this fixation, particularly on China, here is this nation, you know, on our doorstep, which has this huge critical mass of population, which is going to develop more and more.
Oh, look, it's and you mentioned security and geopolitics. You know, obviously Indonesia is our nearest neighbour, and it should be first and foremost in all our security deliberations. It shouldn't be absolutely first in our economic deliberations right now, but it shouldn't come much after the discussion of China. And
it's the fastest growing sugar market in the world. So we've looked at it.
So that's one of your markets.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. You've also mentioned the middle class foods. Indonesia is a poorer country than China is. And just as India is a poorer country than China is.
And,
so
and a much more diverse country.
Yes. And the very steep part of the development curve where per capita consumption of everything from protein to steel to energy just really goes vertical at a point in time. Indonesia and India haven't reached that point yet. At some stage, they will hit it. And when countries the size of India or Indonesia, because we're talking 250 million people and growing, once they move past self-sufficiency in whatever commodity that happens to be, that creates a very large disturbance in the portion of that commodity which is traded internationally. And that is what really drove the commodity price supercycle, which we've just experienced, was China moving past self-sufficiency in any number of things at the same time that it was on the very steep part of the growth curve. Indonesia will do that at some point in the future. And as you say, we might not have the human capital to be perfectly positioned for that.
When you're talking about the scenario where China comes unstuck around the middle of the century, I assume you're basing that on the political structure of China and the possibilities of the sort of, again, the pressure plates of a push from below for some more democratic, some more tolerant form of government.
Well, I should actually say here that these scenarios are agnostic on cause.
Yeah.
So I'm not actually saying this will happen because of...
No, but that premise presumably is based on that.
The people who are...
Or either that or they pollute themselves out of existence.
Yes. Well, those who are most sceptical about the Chinese story, they do point to political structure, but the more sophisticated arguments actually point to the level of income inequality in China. And they make the point that China looks very much like the North Asian societies which have ascended to high income ranks in everything except the fact that their Gini coefficient, which measures the degree to which income is distributed equally or very unequally, looks more like a Latin American or South Asian country than an East Asian one. And income inequality is a source of friction in the long run. And so people do point to that. Now, the question on which one of those scenarios more closely describes China's future will really come down to how the Chinese elites actually approach this issue, whether the Chinese elites, their 1%, if you will, how willing they are to cede some of the wealth to get a more equal distribution between capital and labour in the country. And if they are willing to cede some of those rents that they accrue in the system, and the corruption crackdown right now might indicate that they are, China could easily fulfil the optimistic scenario. If the rents hold on, they eschew reform, they start to look backwards rather than forward, then things could grind to a halt at some point. So it's really about how the elite is willing to do this in a discretionary way. If they're not, eventually income inequality
will tell its story.
Is the crunch.
Alex, when you were talking earlier, and you're talking about the importance of talking about tropical North Queensland, in other words, the tropics, just even the word tropics has the appeal. One assumes then that the tropical economies, to the extent that they're basing their economy on tourism, are competing, and that over time the bulk of your targets are going to come from the non-tropical world. Is that broadly right?
There's an element of truth in that. There are some of the tropical environments that are direct competitors, but I believe that we have some unique natural attributes here that are not prevalent in a number of those environments. And we also have significant investment in infrastructure and tourism infrastructure here. And talking about Keith's scale perspective, we have a little project up the road that people are proposing at the moment that is in that that sphere of investment in terms of the scale. And so I think the scale of investment in this region puts us in a leadership position, and as long as we continue to invest appropriately and continue to attract the investment that is currently being shown, the interest that's being shown, then I think we'll remain competitive. But yes, there's competitive. Tourism is very competitive globally. I've demonstrated that. There's over 4,000 organisations like the one I head globally competing for this business.
And Keith referred to climate change as the story of the day. To what extent do you see the story of the day as a serious threat to your industry here?
Well, absolutely. I mean, again, the whole foundation of our industry is based on the natural attributes. So we need to ensure that the sustainability of those is maintained for years to come. So it's a critical issue, and there needs to be a balance, of course, between the impact of development and the returns that we gain. But ultimately, we can't eat into that capital. We need to maintain the natural capital that we have in this region. Otherwise, we won't have a
So to that extent, does it bother you the extent to which the voice that speaks against climate change or says it's sceptical about climate change appears still to be wielding quite a lot of power, or certainly has a big voice in the debate?
I think there's extremes in this debate, and I think there's some middle ground that we need to get to. And I think that's...
How are we going on that front?
Well, I think if you look at, for instance, tourism operators and the way that they engage with the reef here in this region, the environments that they take visitors to are in very good condition, and they're maintained actually in condition superior to surrounding environments. So, we have a lot of expertise in terms of the actual tourism industry's management, but of course, there are the major implications in terms of the reef in this region, and the reef is not one entity. We tend to talk about the reef as one entity, but in this particular region, obviously agriculture is a major issue, and runoff and nitrates into the ocean are major factors, if you like, versus, if you like, the impact of, for instance, tourism, which was minimal, and certainly the dredging that's maintaining Trinity Inlet currently isn't damaging the reef, but there may be other areas down the coast where dredging is an impact. So we need to understand the differences between the different ecological systems within the reef and the different impacts, and deal with those appropriately in a balanced fashion, and get away from the extremism that's in the media.
Deb Frecklington, since you've sat through the session, I don't want to put you on the spot, and please say no if you want to, but is there any comment that you'd like to make on the basis of what you've heard from the government's perspective?
Thank you, Kerry. I actually think it's been a fantastic session, and I mean, I'm extremely interested in, and I was pleased to hear Keith say that that the Queensland Government has, or has been at least looking at assisting in relation to the development, and that goes as well in relation to tourism development in the north, because obviously we're extremely keen, quite simply just for jobs as well for this northern end of Queensland, and that backs on exactly with what you were just saying there in relation to the environment. And I think I touched on that in my speech, in that we need to ensure that there is a good balance, and there's certainly, we do, in my opinion, need to ensure that we have a good balance with what is actually out there in relation to the reef. And I think we have to be very careful in how we talk about the environment and the reef, because we as a government are doing everything we can to protect that natural asset. And it isn't one big ecosystem. There's a lot of different places right up the coast, and there are agricultural influences on that, as well as the natural occurrences. And I don't want to start another debate, but such as the crown of thorns, etc. So, no, I just think it's been a fantastic session. So, no, thank you.
Thank you, and that is the end of our session, our first session for the morning. After morning tea, of course, we've got a more free-flowing final panel discussion, and I'll be urging you to take the opportunity to develop your own questions, and let's make this next session as free-flowing as we can, and therefore hopefully as informative as we can. So morning tea is just outside, but for this session, thank you very, very much for your contribution. Thank you.